Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Food Safety webinar, Introduction to Produce Safety. This first of a two-part webinar series will introduce general food safety principles for a fruit and vegetable farm, microorganisms that are of concern in fresh produce, the common ways produce is contaminated and how contamination is spread, basic strategies to prevent and reduce exposure to produce to microorganisms and human pathogens. The critical concepts will include basic introduction to the Food Safety Modernization Act, how to conduct basic risk assessments, basic introduction to good agricultural practices and standard operating procedures, the value of a food safety plan and basic steps in monitoring, record keeping, and taking corrective action. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. The IFAI is also scheduling a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety for a listing of these trainings and information about how to register. The in-person training events will result in the award of a certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help you better understand these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the regional training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We're merely trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the regional training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll find the slideshow being presented today. I invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/foodsafety, where you will find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Dr. Rodney Holcomb, will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the questions feature of the control panel. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of the broad efforts we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Rodney Holcomb, the Charles B. Brown Endowed Professor of Food Studies with the Food and Agricultural Products Center at the Oklahoma State University. Dr. Holcomb is a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. His research interests lie in the areas of value-added manufacturing economics and market evaluations. His goals are to identify economically feasible processing alternatives and business structures for adding value to regional agricultural commodities. He is also instructor of 2 agribusiness management courses in which students develop business and marketing plans for Oklahoma companies as their class projects. His programs have received awards from commodity organizations, professional associations, industry groups, the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service, Oklahoma State University, and former Oklahoma Governor's Office. He has also received the USDA Plow Honor Award for exceptional service, the highest award given by the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. Welcome, Dr. Holcomb. The presentation is yours.
Thank you very much, Brian. Glad to have those that are participating today. Glad to have you online with us. We're going to talk a little bit today, as we've already talked about. We're going to talk about an introduction to the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule. Well, let's see if I can make my, here we go. Now we're moving. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking a little bit about the Food Safety Modernization Act, the Produce Safety Rule, and some of the basic tenets of produce safety as it relates to on-farm in packing shed, and transportation to retail settings. The whole intent is so that you would have a better idea of produce safety concerns on the farm, be able to identify different types of pathogens that could contaminate fresh produce and the ones that cause the most problems in the food industry today, and talk about ways that that contamination might be contained or controlled or eliminated. I will also talk about the values of committing to implementing food safety practices, which was the whole intent of the Food Safety Modernization Act anyway. Now, as far as relevance to the farm, as Smokey Bear says, only you can prevent forest fires. Well, when it comes to produce contamination problems and risks on the farm, only you as the farmer can prevent and reduce those risks. Nobody knows your farming operation, your production practices, your personnel better than you. However, not every producer understands the consequences of current production practices or environmental conditions that are on or surrounding your farm and how they impact food safety risks. And as with anything else, you as the producer and your actions directly impact the food safety and the financial viability in the long term for your farming operation. And no farmer I've ever met wants to think that they produce a product that's unsafe for human consumption. So it's very important to think about the value of this produce, because the truth is we've actually taken steps away from cooked food towards more raw produce consumption. And as we've done so, it's created greater opportunities for food safety risks that they accompany the fresh food that we want to eat. If you eat more fresh produce that comes straight from the farm, then we have to be more concerned about some of the food safety risks that also come straight from the farm. Now, as we let's see if we get this to advance. There we go. Oop. We'll get there eventually. There's a little bit of a lag I'm trying to catch up with. Okay. Food Safety Modernization Act. The Food Safety Modernization Act, which everyone refers to as FSMA, was signed into law in January of 2011 by President Obama. And it was stated that this is the most sweeping reform of U.S. food safety laws in over 70 years, really closer to 80 years. And you do have to go back to the 1930s to see some of the big implemented legislation that started what we know now as the whole entire food safety net. Now, we've made all sorts of food safety rules and laws over time, but this is the biggest one where we've had actual compliance be part of it. The overall objective of FSMA is to focus on the prevention of food safety issues. And there are 7 primary rules that came out of FSMA. Now, while the law was signed into effect in 2011, these rules have taken the last 7 years to develop. So we're going to focus today on the produce safety rule, which covers all the standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. But there are other rules as well, preventative control rules for human food, which really apply to food processors. But similarly, you have those same kinds of controls for animal food processors. There's a foreign supplier verification programs rule. That's really to ensure that anything coming into the country meets the same standards of food produced and processed within this country. A rule for accreditation of third-party auditors and certification bodies, just to provide some clear field of compliance and oversight so that all the auditors and third-party observers and certifying organizations follow some standard set of protocol. There's also rules for transportation of human and animal food, and more on a biosecurity level, rules for prevention of intentional contamination and adulteration. The whole intent being we're going to create rules that will help prevent food safety issues that encompasses the entire food safety system. Now, the Produce Safety Alliance curriculum that we're going through today, and you look at the bottom of the slide and you see the words Produce Safety Alliance. That curriculum covers both the FSMA produce safety rule requirements and many of the practices that are included in the good agricultural practices for produce farmers, or GAPs as they're referred to. At least one supervisor from any farm that has to comply with the FSMA produce safety rule has to complete food safety training that is at least equivalent to a standardized curriculum. And the PSA training satisfies that FSMA requirement. In fact, right now, it is the only training that is recognized by FDA as meeting this requirement. So basically, anybody around the country that's going through this FSMA produce safety rule training is going through the Produce Safety Alliance training. Now, if we were in an in-person workshop and you were looking at this slide presentation, but you also had the big manual in front of you, you'd have all sorts of notes that go along with each slide. And this notion of this little symbol that you see in the bottom right corner of the slide, that section symbol, that would mean that something on this slide relates directly to the rules of FSMA. So that section symbol is going to be on every slide where there is something that comes straight from the FSMA produce safety rule. If you also had the manual in front of you, you would see that there is a regulatory reference table that takes some of the curriculum training verbalese and converts it back into the legalese from the law itself. And there'd also be a glossary. So we had certain terms that were in bold. You would have a official or semi-official definition for that term. So you see that here on this slide. If you go to one of the in-person training sessions, you will receive a very thick 3-ring binder full of material that has all this additional information. Now, for the FSMA produce safety rule, this is a big deal for fruit and vegetable growers because this is the first time that you ever had a mandatory federal standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. There have been over the years attempts by FDA to push more voluntary participation in rules. In fact, there was a 1998 rule that was called the Guide to Minimize Microbial Food Safety Hazards for Fresh Fruits and Vegetables. And FDA wanted people to voluntarily comply with that, but now this is mandatory. So this becomes a big deal. So some growers may be eligible for an exemption or exclusion based on what they grow. And the produce safety rule is really, it's designed for produce that is consumed raw. Now, if you grow things that are rarely consumed raw, then you may not need to comply with the FSMA produce safety rule. So we're talking about things like potatoes or sweet corn, things that are generally cooked before they're consumed. You may be exempt for that reason. There's also exemption if your sales are below a certain level. And it's based on, going back a few years, $25,000. If your average 3-year sales of produce are under $25,000, you're exempt. Not because science says you're a small farmer and you're automatically safer than a big farm, but simply because the time and expense of complying with the produce safety rule are going to be fairly prohibitive for a small grower. So if you're growing commodities that are not commonly consumed raw, if these commodities are going to be processed, let's say everything you grow goes to a canning operation where they're going to be cooked and canned. That's a kill step that would kill most, if not all, pathogens that we're concerned about. And of course, talked about the produce sales, and if your sales are to a qualified end user. So in other words, if you're a small farmer selling only at the local farmers market, then you might be subject to an exemption or exclusion from the FSMA produce safety rule. However, ultimately, everybody should understand the food safety risks that can occur on the farm and how to combat those risks. Okay, produce safety rule compliance, it's kind of tricky when you see these business sizes, these dollar sizes. Those are really tied to food sales and not just sales of fresh produce subject to the food safety rule. So let's say, for example, if I have a big diversified farming operation, I'm cutting alfalfa hay, I have cattle and other livestock, I'm growing grains, and I'm growing produce that is subject to the produce safety rule. If the combined sales of all of those things are over $500,000 in the eyes of FDA, I am bigger than $500,000 in all food sales. So if I am, then I was supposed to start compliance with the FSMA produce safety rule last month, in January 26th of 2018. And then it goes down from there. So the smaller you are, the more time you have for compliance. There are even some additional changes that have happened with the water requirements, because FSMA produce safety rules, the first time ever that fruit and vegetable farmers have been required to test and prove the quality and sanitation of the water that's used in all aspects of operation, whether that be irrigation, chemical sprays, frost prevention, or even washing or chilling in the packing shed. So there are some compliance dates that are upcoming. There are some for water that have been changed even as late as 5 months ago, so that water testing and quality standards aren't required for several more years now. Now, when you start looking at outbreaks associated with produce, this is really why the produce safety rule was put into effect. Ultimately, contamination can happen to any produce commodity. So preventing contamination is critical for anybody that grows fruits and vegetables. If you look at just this pie chart that we have here, leafy greens account for about 1/4 of all the produce associated outbreaks that FDA has identified between 1996 and 2014. Those are just the ones they know of. Those don't take into account ones where people didn't report it, didn't take the time to track it back to a produce source, or they didn't show up in a hospital and it wasn't identified that way. Sprouts are also a problem. And in fact, sprouts create so many outbreak concerns or food safety risks. They have their own special set of rules in addition to the rules we talk about today. But you can have outbreaks occur in any number of areas. You can think of the Colorado cantaloupe issue from just a few years ago at Jensen Farms. And you can even have some outbreaks of salmonella in things such as almonds. So all of these things can be a concern, can create a food safety concern, which is the reason for the produce safety rule being what it is. It doesn't take very much for an outbreak to go public, and this doesn't even account for person-to-person spreads of a pathogen. This just refers to direct contact with produce resulted in an illness or an outbreak. Now, when we start talking about these outbreaks and what are the things that we're really worried about, there's the big three: bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And most bacteria are things that we commonly think of. So salmonella, toxigenic E. coli. There are many, many strains of E. coli, and every last person listening to this today has some strains of E. coli in your system right now. You probably don't have the toxigenic ones like E. coli 0157H7, which is one of the ones that we commonly link to foodborne illness. Shigella, Listeria, these are some of the common bacteria that we are concerned about. But you also have viruses that can result in foodborne outbreaks. Hepatitis A, that's one that's commonly tied to outbreaks, not only in fresh produce or even in retail stores themselves, but commonly to food service outlets. And then norovirus, which if you're familiar with norovirus, if you remember some of the stories from the past few years about cruise ships, where there was a quick spread of norovirus among everyone that was on a cruise ship, it spreads fast and it does create some problems. And then, of course, we have different parasites: Giardia, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, Toxoplasma, which is often carried by cats. All of these are things of concern as well. Now, when we think of bacteria, we're talking about microorganisms that can multiply both inside and outside of a host. And like I said, we often think of things such as E. coli 0157H7, Salmonella, and Listeria. If given the right conditions, bacteria can multiply very rapidly. They can double quickly, multiple times within an hour. But good agricultural practices have been designed to reduce some of these risks and try to minimize situations that support bacterial survival and growth. But it doesn't take much for bacteria to grow, to thrive, and to actively spread. And it doesn't take very much for bacteria to have a huge impact on the human population. If conditions are ideal, bacteria can multiply once every 20 minutes. Now, it's doubtful you're ever going to start with just one bacterium, but But it doesn't take long, 8 hours, you have over 16 million cells that we're talking about. And it doesn't take very many cells to make someone sick. And given the right conditions where everything falls into place, you can have all sorts of problems just from bacteria. And most of our produce safety rule requirements are designed to address this issue because bacteria tend to be the most common outbreak issue. But the conditions for bacterial growth, if we get all of these right, then we can have just a firestorm of bacterial problems in fresh food. Now, when you're looking at the food part that you see here on the bottom left of these items that can result in prime bacterial growth conditions, if there are sufficient nutrients there to promote the growth of bacteria that result from poor sanitation, the bacteria find a way into the produce itself from a bruise or a small cut or abrasion, then they may have all the food or nutrients they need to grow and thrive. Water is essential for all pathogen growth. Standing water, condensation at cooler doors where you've got warm, moist outer air and cooler, drier inner air, where they come in contact, you get condensation. That's excellent growing conditions for something like Salmonella or Listeria. Time. If the produce isn't cooled down very quickly as it comes in from the field and it's been exposed to pathogens, maybe from improper sanitation steps taken by an employee who is out picking produce, then if it has time, then produce can or pathogens can grow in the produce. But if we can get them into a cooler, then we can help fight that. And speaking of which, that's where the temperature comes in. Pathogens can grow in a wide range of temperatures between 40, 41 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Pathogens can do pretty well. Cooling can deter most pathogenic growth or multiplication rates, but some pathogens such as Listeria, monocytogenes, they can multiply in a cooler. So they can do pretty well in coolers, and that creates a problem for them. pH, the lower the pH number means the higher acidity. That tends to control pathogens. Pathogens do well in a pretty base environment, somewhere between pH levels of 6.6 and 7.5. But some can grow in pH levels as low as 4.5, which is starting to get fairly acidic. And then oxygen. Most pathogens are aerobic, meaning they need oxygen to grow. Clostridium, botulinum, which we think of for botulism, does not grow in the presence of oxygen, and that's really tied to botulism in canned products. It's not as big a deal for fresh produce. But if all these conditions are right, we can have some serious bacteria problems in fresh produce. And it doesn't take long for a small problem to become a huge contamination and outbreak issue. Now, when we start talking about viruses, prevention's the key. Viruses are small particles. They multiply only in the host, not in the environment or on the produce. However, given the right conditions, those viruses can live long enough to be transferred from, let's say, an ill worker, someone that's sick and didn't wash their hands very well. And I hate to say it, but when we start talking about produce safety, the fecal-oral route comes into play. And honestly, that means you didn't wash your hands after you used the restroom and transferred something from down below the waist to your hands, and that's been transferred to the produce. So contaminated water, improper sanitation on the part of the worker handling the produce, all those can lead to the contamination. Doesn't take much. A few virus particles can make someone ill. I mean, noroviruses are a very good example. All it takes is someone who is sick, who hasn't washed their hands well, and their hands have come in contact with their own feces, their mucus, saliva. They can transfer that easily to a doorknob, and you've created a huge outbreak problem. Viruses can be very stable in the environment if the conditions are just right, and prevention becomes the key to reducing viral contamination. And you'll notice that one of our handouts relates to approved sanitizers for use in fresh produce production operations. And that's there because there are some sanitizers that work very well, some that don't. norovirus is quite a problem. Most sanitizers won't impact norovirus. So that becomes a big issue, and it's an area where a lot of research is still taking place to determine what we can do to help prevent norovirus contamination. But there are limited options, and you have a list of the approved sanitizers if you're interested, attached for the handouts. Now, for parasites like protozoa or intestinal worms, they only multiply in a host animal or in human, but they can be in the environment for an extended period of time. They can be in the soil. They're very commonly transmitted by water. It's often very hard for chemical sanitizers to kill them because many times these things can actually protect themselves. They can create an outer covering that protects them from being killed by chemical sanitizers. And what's even worse is once they get in the body, they can survive for long periods of time before they ever show any symptoms. Before the host ever shows a symptom, those parasites could have been in the host body for years. And to make matters even worse, they can be in that host body and the symptoms may come and go. So if you don't think the symptoms are severe enough, you may not realize that you are a carrier of a parasite. And that is a problem. So all these are things that we're concerned about in fresh produce. Now, the purpose of this slide is just to highlight two things. One, the number of outbreaks caused by different types of pathogens. And two, the impact they can have on the health of the individuals who become ill. So from 1996 to 2014, you've had a little over 170 produce-related outbreaks that occurred. More than 17,000 outbreak-related illnesses, more than 2,000 hospitalizations, and 68 deaths. And this variety of pathogens that have been associated with all these outbreaks. So you've had E. coli, you've had Salmonella, Listeria, Shigella, you've had hepatitis A, norovirus, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, Giardia. All these things have had an impact, and they're accounted in all these illnesses and outbreaks that you see on this slide. So it can have a huge impact, and those are only the ones that we know about, that we're actually able to trace back to a produce issue. So the produce safety challenges really come into following this fresh produce that's going to more often than not be consumed raw, and how these problems might occur. So the microbial contamination on produce is very tough to remove once it's there. It makes its way into natural openings, stem scars, bruises. The rough surfaces are folds. And when you start looking at these three pictures here, the far right, fresh greens, which account for about 25% of the instances where outbreaks occur. But look at that middle picture. That's the surface of cantaloupe. And quite honestly, if you go through the entire FSMA Produce Safety Rule training curriculum and all the different modules that are covered in that curriculum, in most cases, cantaloupe can be used as an example of an area where an outbreak occurs. It's a fruit that grows in contact with the ground, and it's got this rough surface that makes it very easy for pathogens to hide under dirt or biofilm on the surface. So contamination may be sporadic, but given the right conditions and the right surfaces, bacteria can be a big problem, and other pathogens such as viruses and parasites may find a way to hide and be transferred to humans. Now, when we start talking about how can this produce become contaminated, many different sources. We often think of humans as being the source of the outbreak. And once again, we have to go back to the fecal oral route. Somebody doesn't have access to appropriate restroom facilities, and as a result, they don't clean themselves as well as they should. So there may be that fecal oral route becomes a problem. They don't have access to hand washing stations where they can wash their hands. So either because of fecus or something as simple as their saliva or mucus, it gets transferred to their hands, gets transferred to the produce. But it's not just humans, it can be the animals as well. And in fact, in doing these trainings all around the country, we found many instances where a variety of animals could create a problem for a produce farmer. It may be, as we see in the picture here, feral hogs, which are a problem in most states in this country. It could be migratory waterfowl, creating an issue. And right now in Oklahoma, we have all sorts of migratory waterfowl that are landing on wheat fields. You can walk out in these wheat fields and you will see their feces all over the place. In some of the examples we've had from the trainings that we've done across the country, it could be bears, moose have been mentioned as a problem in fields. It could be livestock that manage to get through a fence and get into the produce field. In fact, we had one instance where wild horses were mentioned as the primary contamination concern from animals getting into the field. It can also be issues tied to the soil. So the soil amenities that you use, if you're using composted manure, or hopefully not, but maybe raw manure that you're applying to the soil, that could be the source of contamination. It could also be the water, and we're talking every possible aspect of water use, whether it be for irrigation, whether it be for chemical sprays, frost abatement, or even rinsing or cooling the produce once it makes its way back in the shed. We also can't rule out the buildings, equipment, and tools. How sanitary are the buildings? If every bit of produce is coming out of the field and going to a building where sanitation is not very good, then all of a sudden we've created a bottleneck where everything can be subject to contamination. Or for that matter, equipment and tools. Let's say you are using manure as a soil amenity. Are you using the same tractor and tools for spreading manure that you also use to go back out into the fields to pick produce? So that may be an area for contamination as well. All of those things have to be taken into consideration. Now, contamination, all the ways that we talk about it being spread. From the humans, most commonly it's workers spreading pathogens because they're the ones who directly handle all the fruit and vegetables. So improper health and hygiene practices can be an issue. There's a whole module that we'll cover in another webinar that addresses just these issues. And one of the most important things that an employer or the farm owner can do when you got a sick employee, tell them to go home, and understand that nobody wants to miss out on any pay, and you may need that paycheck, but it's a big contamination issue that in the long term could be a bigger loss in pay for the employee and for the farm owner if a sick worker is the source of contamination. The animals, both domestic and wild animals, they can carry and transmit human pathogens to produce. Field intrusion is the one that we usually think of, but feeding, rooting, like I said, migratory waterfowl, even water sources. We've had a lot of examples where produce farmers start testing their water and realize that certain times of the year they have bigger pathogen issues in the water than they do other times of the year. And it may be the result of a neighbor allowing their livestock into a field at certain times of the year. Livestock is using the same water source, let's say it's a stream or a river, as the produce farmer, and as a result, they're seeing much greater levels of contamination in their water source. And manure runoffs can also be an issue as well. The water itself, everything about the water, the production, the post-harvest water, even unexpected events such as flooding can be a concern. And in some of these trainings that we've done in person, I've heard some horror stories about how a flooding event resulted in contamination of produce because backed up sewer, that water all of a sudden as a result of flood ended up in the produce field. Or where some chemicals were used to control pests, and all of a sudden because of flooding, those chemicals were introduced directly to the produce that was expected to be harvested. So all of this can be a concern. The soil amendments, there is a whole module that we'll go through at a later time in a later webinar that covers all the issues that result from the use of manures and other soil amendments. It doesn't have to be just manures. Even the improper handling of chemical fertilizer can result in a contamination, a chemical contamination of the produce. But there's research going on right now, even to show how the wind can spread manure particles that are the manure being spread on one field, and the particles end up causing a cross-contamination problem on a neighboring produce field. Now, the equipment, tools, and buildings will have different modules associated with just post-harvest contamination concerns and keeping a clean post-harvest facility. But any unclean surface that contacts produce is just as bad as a sick employee touching that produce. Facility management can also impact the level of risk that you're facing. If you ever go to a food processing plant, you'll notice that everything is always mowed and neatly maintained around the facility, because they don't want to create an opportunity where insects or rodents or any other kind of pest can thrive and just kind of serve as a hiding ground that gives them the perfect opportunity to move into the facilities. Same way with a packing shed. The better you keep that facility clean and well mowed and maintained, even on the outside of the facility, it impacts the risk level inside the facility. Standing water and debris are always concerns. We have too many pathogens that love standing water. So those are always things that we have to be considerate of. Now, there is one thing that we do need to talk about very briefly, and that's the difference between cleaning and sanitizing. If you think of cleaning, cleaning is the physical removal of dirt from surfaces, which can include the use of clean water and detergent. So cleaning may first involve brushing off dirt from a surface, then coming in with soap and water to do a washing. Sanitizing is the treatment of an already clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. And you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. Biofilms become a big issue here. This is a big issue, even if you talk about Bluebell ice cream and the Listeria outbreak that Bluebell had a couple of years ago. I talked to one of the inspectors that went into a Bluebell plant to determine where their problem was. It was not that they were not using sanitizer. The problem was in their coolers, they had biofilms building up. You know, you get enough ice cream coming off the packaging or that wasn't removed from the ice cream containers themselves. They rub up against the floor, they rub up against the walls, and it creates a biofilm. And for pathogens, that's about the same thing as a raincoat. You've just given them protection from any sanitizer or washing. So you got to wash and clean a surface first, then come in with a sanitizing agent if you really want to have a good, clean, and sanitized surface for food safety purposes. Okay. The biggest thing that is the takeaway message from this part, and then the part we're going to do March 8th, the second part of this, is that produce safety begins with the commitment of the farmer. Like we said at the very beginning of this presentation, you as a farmer, you know your operation better than anyone. You know the layout of the land, you know the layout of your facilities, you know everything about the production practices, you know everything about your employees. So you are the best suited to identify the safety risks that exist on your farm. And if you're willing to implement some food safety policies and practices to reduce those risks, you better than anyone know the impact that can have on your bottom line, as well as any concerns you may have about, unfortunately, possibly making someone sick with produce from your farm. You know the equipment, you know the facilities, you know what you need for your farming operation, and you know the best way to keep everything clean. So supporting effective food safety training so everyone can be actively involved in reducing risk, that's not just for you. You as the farmer are also the one who will make sure that all your employees follow suit. If someone brings you a watermelon, let's say, that has just a little bit of bird poop on it, and they ask you what they should do, and you say, well, throw it on the trailer, it's going to the store. They'll never ask you again. So you just allowed contaminated produce to be introduced into the food chain, and that employee knows that you're okay with that level of risk. You don't want that. So if you uphold a high level of risk abatement, then so will your employees. You set a good and consistent example on your farm, everyone and everything else in your farm follows suit. Now we're going to open it up for questions, and I'll turn things over to Brian, who's going to remind us, but we'll come through with the second part of this intro section in a couple of weeks. So Brian?
All right, thank you, Dr. Holcomb. I'll remind everyone that if you have any questions about this presentation, or really any question at all that you'd like to pose to Dr. Holcomb, please use the questions feature in your control panel, and you can just type in your question there and it will come to me and I'll read it out loud and Dr. Holcomb will answer it. While you're thinking of your questions, I will just remind you that the second part of our Introduction to Produce Safety webinar series will be on March 8th. And if you go to our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety, you'll find a link there to our webinar series, and all of the registration links for our upcoming webinars are there. And so you can register for our next webinar on March 8th and all of the other webinars that we have scheduled this year. So I'll give you another minute or so to come up with some questions. I'll also remind everyone that Dr. Holcomb mentioned sanitizers, approved sanitizers. We do have a list of those approved sanitizers that I placed in your handouts, the handout section of your control panel. And so you can download those. Those are also available on our website. And we actually did, we've got a question that came in. It's just about the certification that's offered. And the question is, so no certification from the online webinars, only acceptable certification is through the Produce Safety Alliance. So to clarify, the certification is from Produce Safety Alliance, but it's an in-person training. And if you go to our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety, you'll find a link to our in-person trainings. And all of the trainings that we have scheduled in regional locations will be listed there. And there's also a way to contact our food safety coordinator on that page so that you can save your seat for a training.
Brian, I would add to that, the reason the certification is only for the in-person training, this goes back to FDA's expectations for anyone that is operating a farm and is producing these types of produce that are commonly consumed fresh. They have some pretty strict standards for the training and the certification. So we have 7 modules, and this, we're just getting halfway through the first module, what we've covered so far. They have 7 modules, and according to their requirements, you have to go through all 7 of those modules. You have to be there in person. There actually has to be a PSA approved lead trainer at those training programs who says, yes, Brian Pollard went through all 7 modules at one time. If Brian had to leave for a couple of hours and missed a couple of modules, he doesn't get his certification. So they've been very strict about what it takes to receive that certification, which is why we can't provide it with the online webinars.
Thank you. We did have one question that came in. What are some sources for water testing?
Good question. The sources for water testing have changed. In fact, there's a whole module that we'll cover in a webinar just about the sources for those testing. Now, the water testing requirements that originally came out in the Produce Safety Rule required one form of water testing, one approved method of water testing, and it created a big problem for any farmers that are subject to the Produce Safety Rule, because that one method of testing required that the water samples be collected a certain way. They have to be delivered to the lab within 6 hours of collection, and they have to be analyzed within 8 hours of collection. So that created a big problem for any farmer that's trying to get that water testing done. And we do have states where there are no labs that could do that one approved method. So if you're going to try to get those samples, get them to a lab, and the lab has to be waiting at the door basically for you to show up and then test these things quickly and get the results back to you, that became a big problem. So a few months ago, the FDA did come out and say, okay, we finally approved more testing methods in hopes that we get more labs that are approved to provide those types of training or testing results, and I'm trying to dig it up here. You know, we have to, let's see, equivalent testing methods for ag water. Let me see if I've got it here. Okay, so there have been a few additional equivalent testing methods that were added back in November. And I can quickly run through them. We may have to just, I think this may now be available through a link through Indigenous Food and Ag's website.
Yeah, Rodney, if you can actually send me those, then I will post them to our website when I post the video for this webinar, so that people can access those links afterwards.
Okay, I'll do it. There have been 8 additional methods that have been added, and you'll just have to kind of check and see which labs can provide that level of testing. So I'm in Oklahoma, and I know our State Department of Agriculture can do some of those methods, and we only have 1 or 2 other labs in the state that can do any of those approved methods. So it is a little bit of a challenge, but we'll make that available to you, and any attendees will have this list.
All right. So I've not seen any other questions coming in. So Dr. Holcomb, did you have any final thoughts to leave people with before part 2 on March 8th?
As we get into part 2, we'll start talking more about, these have been kind of the basics. We'll cover more of the basics in part 2, but it'll get more into what is expected of the grower in terms of complying with the produce safety rule. So I look forward to visiting with you again in 2 weeks.
All right. Once again, I'd like to thank our presenter, Dr. Rodney Holcomb. He will also be the presenter for our part 2, which will be happening on March 8th. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to you joining us next time.
Thank you, Brian.